Here at this meeting and elsewhere, we've heard a lot about the disaster that is unfolding before us. The rise of police repression and brutality, with millions of people locked up, and the police choking people, brutalizing people, and killing people, also accompanies an economic crisis. Good-paying industrial jobs that once existed for the working-class people in this country have been eliminated. The next generation of workers face a lifetime in short-term, low-wage service sector jobs. Now, it's important that we make this link. That's why in FIST we've often been talking about a low-wage police state. The reality is that because of technology and deindustrialization, there are millions of people, especially youth, in this country that aren't profitable any longer for the billionaires. The capitalists can't make money from hiring them, paying them to do useful work, so instead they're locking them up in prisons. The economic crisis and the rise of police repression are absolutely linked. Now, why is all this happening? Why is the U.S. transitioning so rapidly into a low-wage police state? If you go throughout U.S. society, you'll find a lot of different answers. There's a rise in conspiracy theories right now. I know you meet a lot of people. If you go out on the street, you meet a lot of people who talk about the Illuminati or the shady group, the Trilateral Commission, or there's conspiracy theories, the Freemasons. The Democrats, of course, blame the Republicans. The Tea Party and the Libertarians tell you that the U.S. isn't capitalist enough. There's a lot of different answers. Every different political faction or grouping representing every different class or strata has a different explanation. So which one do you pick? Who do you listen to? Well, I think a good place to start, if you want to know why the problems are taking place, is to listen to the people who've achieved the most in fighting against these problems and fighting against these injustices that have been coming down. And there's one group that almost everyone recognizes as being the most important anti-racist organization in the history of the last few decades in the United States, if not in the entire history of this country, and that's the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are remembered as being very important, very dynamic, a revolutionary organization that inspired and captured the imagination of millions of people. And today, if you go to the rallies around Black Lives Matter, you'll see a lot of young people wearing shirts with Huey Newton or Angela Davis on them. There are millions of youth who are part of this uprising and millions of people at large who know who the Panthers are and are very inspired by them and love them. So what did the Black Panthers say? What did they say about the cause for all the problems throughout U.S. society? Well, I brought with me one book that was actually required reading for everyone in the Black Panther Party, and this is the Little Red Book, or Quotations from Chairman Mao. And in the Little Red Book, Mao Zedong talks about capitalism, and the way he defines capitalism, or a system, he says that capitalism is profits in command. Now that pretty much sums it up. Profits in command. The reason the next generation of workers are making such low wages is because lower wages means higher profits. The less the workers at Starbucks, McDonald's, and Rite Aid get paid, the more the people who own these stores get to make in profits. Unemployment also means higher profits. The more people that are competing for jobs, the lower the wages people are willing to accept. Think about all the money that the banks are making from student loan debt, like Ramiro just illustrated. Young people desperate to get a job, desperate to support themselves, spend thousands and thousands of dollars trying to get a degree, hoping that they will be more qualified. They get into debt, and the banks get rich. And now let's talk about the prisons. All over this country, they're setting up private prisons. That's prisons for profit. Wells Fargo, a bank that has foreclosed on thousands of families all across places like Michigan, Ohio, and California, is one of the primary shareholders in something called Corrections Corporation of America. They also run something else called GEO Group. All across this country, when young people get locked up, they make money. And there's been a lot of talk about the militarization of the police right now in Ferguson. And if you look at all these high-tech weapons, the same corporations that supply the Pentagon with the drones and the bombs and the weapons they use to destroy people all over the world, we're talking about Lockheed Martin, General Electric, who make billions of dollars from death and destruction from war in far-off countries, are now making billions of dollars selling the cops right here the tools of repression. The war profiteers are now making money from a new war, a war against black and brown people here in the United States. So what did Mao say? He said, profits in command. That's what capitalism is all about, profits in command. Houses don't get built under this system so people can have shelter. They get built so landlords and banks can make money selling them, renting them, and so forth. Food doesn't get produced so people can eat it. Food is produced so that agribusiness can make profits. Food is grown, processed, and manufactured so the billionaires who own the stores and the food processing companies and agribusiness can make money from selling it. They don't have schools under this system so children can learn. They have schools so that children can become obedient workers, and you can see that. And now as they've de-skilled the jobs, you're seeing public education being destroyed. They don't need an educated workforce anymore. As long as you can push a button, they want you on there. And frankly, they want you as uneducated as possible, because if you get some education and you learn about the facts, you might rise up and revolt. And they always tell us the police, now they exist to keep us safe, right? They're here to just protect us, right? Well, I'll say it's different. You want to know the real nature of the police? Look at the way they've been acting at these demonstrations around Black Lives Matter and police brutality. Arresting people, beating them up, macing it. We've seen what they did at Occupy Wall Street and elsewhere. But have you ever noticed it's a little bit different when the Ku Klux Klan has a rally? Now, numerous times when these racists and fascists have their rally, not only do the police not beat them up and arrest them, they actually stand in front of them and protect them from the people. Or what about when the Tea Party has a rally? Or what about when these anti-immigrant bigots have a rally? How do the police act? Do they respond with do they respond with the same brutality? Of course not, because the Klan and the anti-immigrant bigots and the Tea Party and the cops are on the same team. They work for the 1%. And that's the reality. You know, you look at the United States, who were these founding fathers who set up the United States? These founding fathers, who were they? They were slave owners. They were the owners of property. These were the rich people. These were the 1% of that time. And just like the people who wrote the Constitution saying that black people were 3/5 of a human being, they wrote it on behalf of the slave-owning billionaires. The government today serves Wall Street. It serves the billionaires, the people that are getting rich as our wages are going down, the people who are getting rich as people are being locked up. That's the reality of the system that we live under. The Black Panthers understood this. That's why they called themselves Marxist-Leninists. They actually wanted to get rid of this system where profits come before people. But let's go back a little bit further. Why do we have programs like Social Security? Why do we have the right to form unions? It's because of another group of Marxist-Leninists called the Communist Party. Back in the 1930s, when the Communist Party was still a revolutionary organization, they led these organizations called unemployment councils. At the time, there was a depression. People were hungry and starving. And the Communist Party went to people and said, don't starve, fight. When a family would get kicked out of their home, the Communist Party would come and break the lock and put their possessions back into the house. Currently, the Democrats like to talk, you hear, like, especially Joe Biden, he likes to get up and say that, you know, the job of the Democrats, we want to bring the good-paying industrial jobs back to this country. We want to bring the jobs back. What they're leaving out is that though the jobs in basic industry were not always good-paying jobs. Back in the 1920s, people who worked in steel mills, garment factories, auto plants often made poverty wages, about the same as what fast food workers make today. But the Communist Party organized them. All across this country, they had sit-down strikes, where workers occupied their factories and refused to leave unless they got better wages and the recognition of a union. The Communist Party back in the 1930s, the Black Panther Party of the 1960s, 70s, and I think early 80s were both able to achieve what they did, winning great victories against the bankers and the billionaires because they were armed with the science of Marxism-Leninism. If you were a biologist and you wanted to go out and make a new discovery in the field of biology, you couldn't do it without doing some studying first. You'd want to know what Gregor Mendel and Charles Darwin had to say, and then once you'd learned that, and once you'd learned what's already been discovered, you could go out with new innovations and make new discoveries. That's what Marxism-Leninism is. Marxism-Leninism is the science of revolution. It's the science of building up organizations of the workers and the oppressed who can fight against injustice, push back the billionaires and bankers, and win great victories. Marxism-Leninism is not a religion, it's not a doctrine, it's not a dogma. Marxism-Leninism is a science like anything else, but it's the science of the working class and the oppressed fighting back against injustice, against the 1%. But it doesn't stop there. Marxism-Leninism isn't just the science of day-to-day battles. Marxism-Leninism is a science of revolution. Marxist-Leninists are striving every day to overthrow the capitalists. We want to take these banks and these factories and these airlines and these TV networks and all the major commanding heights of economic power. It's workers like us that make them function, and it's workers like us who should own them. And that's going to mean we're going to need a new government. We're going to get rid of this constitution written by slave owners. We're going to get rid of all their cops and all their prisons. And we're going to have a government run by the people. We're fighting for people's power. Socialist revolution means no more prophets in command. It means organizing society so everyone has a job, and everyone is included in the process of building up and building a better life for the people. It means a society where we can make sure no one is hungry or homeless. It means a society where the government is actively mobilizing the people to fight back against racism, sexism, and anti-LGBT bigotry, and trying to eradicate every form of oppression. All over the world, there have been countries that have had victories, and they've kicked out the global capitalist system, or imperialism, which is capitalism in its global stage. And all of those countries have achieved great victories in winning liberation for the people. You look at Cuba today, the highest life expectancy in Latin America. Everyone can see a doctor when they're sick. No one is unemployed. Great strides have been made for women's rights and women's liberation and the struggle against sexism and patriarchy. You go to the socialist countries of the world. The Soviet Union, when it existed, one of their greatest achievements, I think, was the support they gave to the black liberation struggle in the United States. At the time, there was Jim Crow segregation in the South. Not only did the Communist Party align, the U.S. Communist Party align with the Soviet Union, have demonstrations against it, they actually had demonstrations in the Soviet Union against racism. They had rallies in Moscow and Red Square with signs that said down with Jim Crow and down with the Ku Klux Klan. And that level of solidarity was very, very important. Now, at one point, Robert F. Williams, who was a leader of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina, he was fighting back against the KKK with arms, and he had to flee the United States. They were trying to put him in prison after a shootout with the Ku Klux Klan. And where did he go? He went to Cuba. And he went to China, another country that had recently had a revolution. And from there, they were able to broadcast. In the South, they had Radio Free Dixie, and he was able to broadcast messages calling for revolution and calling out the capitalist and the racist system. You know, great things have been achieved, but every country that's ever had socialism has still been surrounded by capitalism. There's still been capitalism there, and as a result of that, they've never been able to fully flourish. Only when capitalism is brought down at its center, and I'm talking about right here, its center, imperialism, only then will we be able to see socialism blossom into the truly beautiful and amazing thing that it can be. And that's going to require a world revolution. It's interesting, you know, people tell you that communism is a foreign thing. I remember one time I was waiting for the bus when I was living in Queens. There's a guy who walked up to me. I was wearing a Hammer and Sickle t-shirt, and he said to me, you know, why are you wearing a Russian symbol? Well, the Hammer and Sickle is not a Russian symbol. The Hammer and Sickle is not a symbol of a country. It's not a foreign symbol. The hammer stands for workers, the people who build things. It's a tool. It's a tool used by laborers to produce things or to fix things. It's a symbol of work. And the sickle also stands for work, but it's the work associated with agriculture and growing food. It's a bit outdated. People aren't out using sickles anymore. But if you look at that hammer and sickle, the hammer and sickle is an emblem that represents labor, toil, work. It's a symbol of the source of all wealth in the world. It is labor that produces everything. Every building in the New York City skyline was built by workers. Every product in every store was manufactured by workers, packaged by workers, shelved by workers, and it's being sold by workers who are probably making minimum wage as they sell it to you there at the counter. When we talk about the working class, we aren't talking about people with a certain income level or people who work on the assembly lines. We're actually talking about almost everyone. Those of us who work for a living, we are the working class. But from the work that we do, somebody else gets rich. The factories, the banks, the stores, the hotels, the restaurants, they all have owners. These owners, or capitalists, turn the hard work that we do into profits. And it's because of this setup that our society is distorted. It's full of racism, repression, poverty, discrimination, low wages, hunger, and homelessness. The drive for profits is pushing the human race in a very dangerous direction. Wall Street right now is actually dangerously moving. If you look at what they're doing around the world, there's a real danger of a new world war. Right? A war with Russia, a war with China, that's not a war that they're going to be able to fight with drones. That's going to be a war that will involve millions and millions of people dying. And I say that if Wall Street starts a new war against Russia or China, it's our responsibility to turn the guns around and make war against the war makers and fight against the billionaires in this country who are destroying the future of this generation and people all over the world. We say that the world doesn't have to be this way. Like the Black Panthers and the revolutionary organizers of the past, we are armed with Marxism-Leninism and we have a job to do. We have to stand in solidarity with the amazing mass uprising going on right now against police terror. We have to support it and participate in it in every way possible, but that's not enough. We have to find a way to transform this mass rebellion against the racist cops into a rebellion against the entire racist system. We have to find a way to get the low-wage workers who are organizing right now, the millions of young people in the streets right now, to look for inspiration and to really understand what the Black Panthers and other great black revolutionaries in the history of this country have understood, and what the Communist Party understood back in the 1930s, and what so many organizers, you go back to even the struggle for the abolition of slavery. There were many Marxists. You know, Marx was still living at that time, but people connected with Karl Marx were involved in the struggle for the abolition of slavery. We need a revolution to overthrow this entire system that puts profits before people. I want to end this way because, you know, all of us here at this meeting are people that are involved in the movement somehow, I think. Most of us have been to demonstrations and rallies. But I want to talk because it's important that we get out of this kind of this vacuum. We need to go to where our class is. You know, if you're working at a job, you need to talk to your coworkers. Maybe not when the boss is around, but, you know, find a way. Or if you're a student, you need to talk to your classmates. You know, you need to talk to the people in your neighborhood. We need to have conversations. We need to build up the consciousness of the working class. If somebody asks you who the communists are, you can tell them this. We are the people that fight against injustice. We are the people that brought you the weekend and union rights. We organized against Jim Crow segregation, and we are the ones who built the mass movement to end the Vietnam War. And if somebody asks you, what is it that the communists want, you can say, we want a society where the people are on top, and the billionaire exploiters have to face justice for the crimes that they've committed against the people all over the world. And if somebody asks you, okay, how do we get to communism? How do we get there? What do we do? You should tell them the first thing we've got to do is smash the low-wage police state. It's interesting, you know, kind of going off of what comrades said when they raised that important book by Sam Marcy about the Klan and the government. I remember when I was like 8 or 9 years old, living in Ohio. I lived about 2 hours away from Cleveland. Cleveland was the biggest, you know, city in the nearby area. And I remember that the Ku Klux Klan had a rally in Cleveland. And it was coming up in like a week in advance, and my family would always watch the local news. And I remember on the local news, they would interview every night beforehand. They would do stories about, you know, there's this Klan rally coming up, and they would interview the leader of the Klan, and then they would just give him these long interviews to promote himself and all of that. And then they would interview like the police chief about, you know, is there going to be peace and law and order at this rally, or is there going to be, you know, and just every night they just brought it up there. And of course they would always speak in like, oh, you know, he's hated or something, but they always gave him a platform. And frankly, it reminds me of how the media treated, do you remember the, what was it, the Occupy Hong Kong? It was the same kind of thing, you know, or when there were protests in Iran. I remember it's the same kind of thing. Whenever there's an uprising going on in a country that is against the U.S., a country that's on our team, a country that's supporting the protests here, a country that's fighting against Wall Street, whether that country is actually building socialism or whether they've just broken out and have had kind of a national democratic revolution, you know, the Wall Street media all of a sudden treats those protests as if they're, you know, romantic uprisings and all of that. But yet when we protest here, we're portrayed as lawless and dangerous and criminals, and that, you know, I think there's a level of confusion. I think, you know, especially coming out of the 60s, a lot of people in the movement, they identify just with protesters. They think protesters are great. Well, protesters in this country that are fighting against the 1% in Wall Street are great, but the Tea Party sure as hell isn't great. The Ku Klux Klan sure as hell isn't great. The American Nazi Party sure as hell isn't great. And you know what? The people that are getting funding from Wall Street to disrupt and cause disruptions in countries that are under attack by Wall Street, they ain't great either. And that's something that's kind of missing out. And on the point that Sarah Catt made, you know, one point about the DPRK is that it is brought up a lot. People will say about the family. They'll say, you know, why is it that Kim Il-sung, his son, his biological son, Kim Jong-il, is leading the country, and then now Kim Jong-un, the biological son of Kim Jong-il, is leading the country. And the point of that is that, you know, the DPRK is surrounded. It's under constant military attack. And we know from the history of the collapse of the Soviet Union and a lot of the socialist countries of Eastern Europe that one tactic that the imperialists use when they're trying to bring down a socialist country is to divide them. They'll start talking in the press about, oh, the hardline faction and the moderate faction and all of that. And by having, Kim Il-sung, who is, the undisputed leader of the revolution, having his biological son as the leader, and Kim Jong-un, is a way to make clear that nothing has changed. That the principles of the Korean Revolution, the fighting the United States, building up a socialist state, fighting for independence, there hasn't been any change. And by building up, a reverence for their leadership, that's a way to make clear that they are still committed to that revolution, and that they are not going to stray from that path. And that brings me to the point about, if you look at all these countries throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, at the time that they all collapsed, they were all having market reforms, and they had leaders that were saying things like, well, Marxism's a little out of date, and maybe we shouldn't emphasize class, we should talk about universal human values, and maybe we'll take a loan from this Wall Street bank and all of that. All those countries are gone. But if you look at Cuba today, and you look at the DPRK, these are countries that did the opposite. They've built up socialism, they've built up their revolutionary principles, they've maintained firmly in revolutionary anti-imperialism, and they've not attempted to dismantle their socialist economic infrastructure, and as a result, they're still there. And I think there's a lesson in that for all of us. I know that there are a lot of important protests and demonstrations coming up, but one thing I think it's very important that we need to raise in the struggle right now is to free all the people who've been arrested in the recent demonstrations. And the people... It's important to point out, what they're doing with this bridge incident. They've got the faces of people, and there's some kind of, I guess they call it a manhunt or whatever. That's very scary. They're very much trying to play up that protesters are dangerous, and we need to overwhelmingly be clear that all people who've been arrested in these demonstrations, no matter what political tendency they're from, no matter what they allegedly did, they need to be freed. Amnesty for all of them. If they can free the cop who choked Eric Garner to death, they should be able to free anyone who's participated in the righteous demonstrations of the people. And we need to be on the forefront saying that, because frankly, one disappointment, I don't see that at rallies. I don't see that demand being raised at the demonstrations. That's one important contribution that we can make as FIST and as Workers' World Party and as revolutionaries. That's one important contribution we can make. And I wanted to correct myself, because I believe I kind of misspoke earlier when I said something about the way communists operate. Communists, it's interesting in the press right now, there's a lot of talk, especially back during the early days of the Ferguson uprising, there was a lot of talk about outside agitators. And I want to be clear, people don't rise up against racism or against police brutality or against low wages because communists tell them to. Yeah. People rise up against unjust conditions because that's what human beings do. If you push on somebody, eventually they're going to push back. What communists can offer is the history of struggle and the scientific methods in guiding that fight back. But it's important that I make clear that that the people in Ferguson aren't fighting because communists told them to. They're fighting because they're human beings and they're resisting, and they're fighting back against oppression. And if you read, there's What Is to Be Done. I've been reading that book a lot lately by Lenin, and he talks about this. And he says sometimes revolutionaries, they get under the impression that they're going to make the revolution. They're just going to call it, and they're going to say, on this day we're going to have a revolution, and then everyone will show up, and that's how it happens. That's not how it happens. Revolutions are spontaneous uprisings of the oppressed. However, if you don't have a program, if that uprising remains spontaneous and it doesn't get a program, eventually leaders of the old system are going to creep in and pull it back into the wing of the old system. And the role of revolutionaries is, when there is a spontaneous uprising of the oppressed, to provide the leadership that can point it away from the old system and toward the new world. And I think that's what Lenin was communicating in his pamphlet, What Is to Be Done. So I apologize if I misspoke there. Thank you.